So if I may, I'd like to start with a very general question just to set the scene. And hopefully we can pass across the panelists and you can each give your view on this. The first is a very general comment, which is that does everyone understand what big data is? Or is it a term like BIM, which actually needs to be explained and is very different depending on your business or the industry that you're in? So really the question is, what is big data for you and your particular industry?
From our side, on a design perspective on buildings, because we consult for building design, we're quite accustomed to big data through the BMS systems and lighting systems, etc., that are associated with operating the hotels. So what we would term as big data would be that pool of information sitting on the BMS servers, which sit with the clients.
Okay.
Not too sure how BIM plugs into that, but other than it could be another platform that you could pull the data from and visualize it better.
Okay. Arsen.
Yeah. From a contracting background, I can tell that there is a convergence between BIM and big data for us. And for me, it's a daily challenge to sort of convince people that BIM is not just a 3D. It has a hidden, massive big data behind that, and we need to all derive parts of it that is relevant to our daily work. That's where we are in this dilemma of big data versus BIM at the moment.
Yeah.
For BIM, there's actually different definition of BIM. Someone can define BIM as building information modeling. Someone can define BIM as building information management. And some of my infrastructure friends will gonna define BIM as bridge information modeling. But among this definition, the most important and the most consistent one is information. Without information, there's no BIM. If we don't put information on the model, there's no BIM. So I think, and the information and data in BIM is actually massive. So.
Answer.
BIM by definition is the building information modeling. So the information itself, it's only unit can define the information, the amount of data on it. The function which BIM used to do, it was been used before in a conventional way by human beings, but whenever this amount of information, or I would say the inherent data is getting bigger than what human can handle, it was the invitation for BIM to come over. So the data and the big data is the core of the BIM, and the more data is getting bigger, the stronger call for the BIM is coming on board.
Okay.
Just trying to answer your question, I think big data is not as popular as BIM, and I think the advantage of BIM was maybe a disadvantage as well, that it was connected to the 3D model, as you said earlier, while big data is not attached directly to anything. And you know, BIM, you ask 3 people, you get 4 definitions. I think big data, you ask 3 people, you get hundreds of definitions, all linking into big data and the amount of unstructured and structured information. So I don't think it's as popular as BIM at the moment.
Again, though, we can view the term big data, if we look at it just for our industry, as this collection of data that happens for our benefit in the construction industry. You're right, there's all the social media and all that side of things, which is normally, I think, probably where the phrase was coined. But if we are considering it just as a collection of data that we use ourselves within our construction industry, then it's what's drawn from the BIM model, but it's also what's drawn from the rest of the information on the project as well. Yeah,
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, from a main contractor's point of view, we see big data as every aspect of the project, from the drawings we receive to the warranties for a particular asset to the models themselves. So obviously the big fear with big data is losing information when it passes from the designer, the architect, or even your subcontractor. So big data is important to stabilize the project, to make sure that you don't lose any of that information. And also we see big data is in it could mean something different for everybody. So you need the right people to review that data that they're receiving from the project itself, so that you can interpret it to what way to benefit the project.
Yeah.
Sure. So coming from the technology vendor's side, so I came from Aconex. Aconex was then acquired by Oracle, so I'm sort of coming from that perspective. So I think big data is really about this transition from, you know, an industry that was very document-focused, document-centric, as we sort of transition into this much more data-driven economy and world and industry, where it's not so much about, you know, just managing the documents. It's about managing the processes and then, you know, extracting the insights about those processes. So that's maybe another way of looking at it.
Yeah. Again, maybe just sticking with yourself. I quite like this phrase that's called harvesting. To me, it kind of visualizes, you know, what we do within all the information that's in a project. You know, we harvest this data. Where do we see the biggest gains from this harvesting of information? You know, it's quite maybe easy to gather all this information, but, you know, where do we see it really being mostly beneficial?
I think it's going to help us. You know, like the information itself can tell us what happened. Okay, but so what? You know, it's one thing to know what happened, but it's about sort of progressing further down. So, you know, from what happened, we can use data to then, or harvest the data to then tell us, well, why did that happen? You know, why were there those delays? Then we sort of move further along to, you know, what do we need to fix? You know, what do we change? And then what do we do next time? So without being able to harvest this data, you're constantly just looking at the here and now rather than sort of looking at, you know, what we need to change for next time.
Yeah, we might come back to that comment later on. That was an appropriate one. Derek, again on this idea of harvesting all the project that's available, all the information that's available on a project, from a contractor perspective, you know, where do you see that advantage in pulling this data together?
Well, I suppose the overall advantage of what we're aiming to do is give that information to the client. So at the end of the day and at the beginning of the project, it's to benefit the client. I think it was the last panel discussion that the term BIM BAM Boom was used. So the operation of the building is where the most money is going to be spent. So the gathering of the information is on the construction side. You also have the information from the design side. So it's not losing the information that's moved from design to the construction, and then all the information that's gathered during the construction stage moved to the handover to the client. So the main advantage that we're looking for is to give the client all the information that they need to run and operate the building successfully, and save them money in gathering all that information, that we are able to collect that information for them during construction. I think that's the main benefit.
Okay. In this term, when we're doing this, Nikki, if I can direct this one to yourself, do current sort of contracts and legal documentation and BIM documentation, do you think they go far enough in specifying what data needs to be collected and for what reason? You know, are contracts and things good enough today to be doing that? Or if they're not, then what do we need to be doing to change that so that people understand the data that they have to deliver?
Yeah, I think at the moment this is a big battle in terms of contracts. Acom mentioned earlier there's a new FIDIC out. So what? It's 2017 out, but we're still using 87 and 99. Yeah. We're very slow in adopting newer form of contracts. I read recently an interview about, or an article about the BIM protocol, which even in the UK, where they came up with it, is not a solid document. And I think it's more down to the consultants working on the project to come up with the right documentation, starting from the early EIRs and moving to the project execution plans, and being able to draft conditions. Again, it's a contract, so it needs to be mutually acceptable. So, and because you're doing the contract, you're discussing with maybe a consultant, a contractor, or an operator, you can put whatever you want in that contract. You don't need to wait until the industry comes back with some FIDIC 2022. We can work with it straight away. And just to follow up on what Derek said earlier, in operations, I think that's where I see at the moment the use of big data. Again, a problem in the region and in construction in general, when we need to do VE, they're the first things to go out. If you have sensors, why do I need sensors? Well, your building will perform better. Yeah, but it's cheaper to build. You have this argument all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else comment on this, the legal documentation or the contractual BIM documentation that we're seeing these days? Does it go far enough in specifying the data that needs to be collected? You know, I mean, we talk about you'll have drawings to deliver, you might even have models to deliver, but does it actually talk about the inherent data that's in these things? What's your own experience of seeing that, Arsene, you know, in the documentation that you see? Does it talk about data specifically?
We have seen very diverse set of documents, and they were predominantly dependent on the types of projects that we tendered for or we delivered. One of the distinct ones that I can identify is probably the airports, where the information for the end user is quite specific, and it differs from everything else that we do. But at the same time, I can stress on the fact that more residential type of buildings would tend to have very generic requirements, not specific and not defined. So I can see that there is a big difference between the types of projects and their data requirements or information requirements at the outset of the project. So it ultimately comes down to the end user and how aware they are about the end use of the data that we generate at the construction stage.
Maybe if I could, so Joylin, again, from your perspective, on the deliverables that you're having to send out to your clients, you know, how specific are they being on these data requirements that they need? Are they being specific? Are they not? Do they know what they need? Do they know why they need it? What's your experience?
So on the specific of the data, normally we first define it at the early stage of the project. So during the EIR or during the delivery stage, we know what the client wants and what the client exactly paid for. We can deliver an LOD 500 when the client paid for LOD 300. We can only give what's specified in the contract. So it's actually very challenging because as a consultant, the first question is that why are we modeling this? What's the whole purpose? Where's the end goal? Are we just modeling our model? Are we just doing BIM for the contractor to make it as a user guide on how to build the project? Or are we using BIM so that are we modeling something that the contractor can actually use and develop and then later on pass on to the facility management team? So.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're going to talk about this a bit, but that seems to be the key data requirement is to pass on to that operation and maintenance, you know, part of the project.
Sorry, Craig, just one more thing. We have a client who recently said he wants an LOD 500 model, and when we asked him what exactly does he want, we had the facilities team in there as well. They said just put everything in it, which makes it very difficult to manage it. So during design and construction, you would have more details, but when you move into FM, you should have less and make it more flexible and easy to use.
That would certainly shorten the contractual documents if they just said we want everything, just written.
Well, that's what big data means, yeah? It's everything.
Interestingly, maybe again for yourself, Mansour, what are the risks to maybe some of the companies that don't or can't take advantage of this, this data sort of revolution that's going on. And is that maybe an issue for companies further down the supply chain?
That's a good question. Let me just share with you a little bit story from the history. Like 3 years back, whenever we find out a clear BIM requirement or a kind of client requirement for BIM to be implemented in the project during the tender stage, we report this to our management as a challenge, because at the time we're scared that the market cannot cope up or our supply chain cannot support us. Nowadays, when there is a project which does not have a requirement, we report this as a challenge. Or like contrary to what we used to do before. The problem here is we get used to BIM and we are implementing BIM by default, and whenever there is absence of requirements, we get the risk first that the design might not be well coordinated, and that puts us in a big risk later on as a contractor. And second, we have to implement BIM by ourselves, and we need to build this cost now became part of our prelims. So we get the risk that maybe our competitor will not price for. At the same time also, maybe it will be very difficult to justify to our client later on why our prelims are high. I told this story just to explain how BIM became very essential these days. And especially last year, I used to receive the BIM model part of the tender document for most of the bid project we have. And I fully agree with the statement made in the first session that releasing BIM model part of tender documents is dramatically reducing the tender queries. Frankly speaking, now whenever we don't have the BIM model, we put this as a first query to client. Kindly provide us the BIM model, because we fully understand that it is there, and once we receive it, we are able to dig the information by ourselves. So coming back to your part of question, is it a risk? Definitely it's a big risk now for any contractor who doesn't have the BIM capabilities, and also it's a bigger risk to client who does not put BIM part of his original design, because he will be exposed to huge risk of incoordination of the project design at the beginning.
I think that there's a really good point in there, which you said that even if it's not specified, for a lot of us, it just makes sense to do it because it's the most efficient,
it's not an option anymore.
way.
We have to put it on board.
Yeah. So even if it's not in that original documentation, it's still going to be what you do as your business as usual setup. So there's some figure here. So I lifted this. A case study had shown that data-driven BIM can reduce construction project cost by an estimated 18% and cut the projected completion time by up to 12 weeks. A wonderful claim that is. I mean, is that, do you think that's realistic? Is there a direct relationship between utilizing the data in our projects and being able to cut time and cost from our construction budgets or construction time?
Yeah, I think, you need to gather more data from more projects to analyze the results. But we're definitely seeing less waste. Say even from our MEP subcontractors reporting that because they're able to model and do their coordination, that their install on site there's zero waste is what we're hearing back. So that's just one good look result. So I'm sure there'll be many more when you gather all the data and research more from different projects as well. So I'm sure other projects will see the same results.
Yeah. What about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, just a more general statement. I mean, your question was more around do BIM projects necessarily lead to projects that can complete ahead of time? But as a more general statement, I think what's true is that projects that digitize, and we've seen various speakers who 2 years ago they had the word BIM in their job title. Now it's digital something, right? So I think there's this theme of the projects that do digitize and they digitize their processes, BIM being one of them, or a certain aspect of it. I think those are the projects that are able to highlight, which processes are causing us trouble, and being able to sort of have this sort of high-level view of your project where your data is floating up into these dashboards. to be able to then drill into the problem areas. I think it's the problem areas that are the ones that cause the delays in projects. So if you can identify the problem areas, you can zoom in on them and then address them. And then, I think that's how we see projects, completing ahead of time and so on.
Yeah. I mean, as the industry that you're in, where you're dealing across, all contractors, consultants, the whole industry, let's say, are you actually using that tool to be able to analyze, projects in a region, projects in a country?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I kind of can talk about this sort of having come from the Aconex side, but at Aconex our mission was really to kind of connect all of the project teams. So whether you're a contractor or a consultant or owner or even subcontractors and suppliers, we sort of had this model whereby we got everyone to come onto the platform. And because of that, we were able to sort of get a huge amount of data into the platform. And I think one of our sort of claims to fame, I don't know how true it is, but that we had the largest construction database in the world. So yeah, that is a big area of focus now, and continue on now that we're sort of with Oracle, is to be able to sort of look at whether it's project types or project types in certain regions. We're able to sort of see that, okay, RFIs tend to run for X number of days for infrastructure projects in Saudi compared to a different type of project in a different part of the world. And so I think there's really some interesting insights that you can sort of pull out of that.
Yeah.
And that's it. Yeah.
So I'd like to go back to something that we touched on there, which is about this data or information at what we would say the handover stage, the completion of the construction phase, and you're handing over, and we're now entering into this operation and maintenance, facilities management stage in the project. Personally, I believe this is a step that our industry needs to look at, because I genuinely don't think we're focused enough on this. And I don't believe that our FM industry is truly connected to our construction industry. And I think a lot of that has to do with this, traditionally, what this handover has been. Now, so the first question really that springs to mind is that how do we understand exactly what that FM industry needs if we can't get them involved early enough to tell us what they want? What do we do? What do we need to do as an industry, do you think? Because I'm sure it's this handover. If they were involved early enough, they could tell us exactly what we want, and therefore we could, hone our deliverable to be exactly what they need.
From a design perspective, where we've got access to clients who build and operate, during the initial design, before we even start concept or scheme, what we do is we'll engage with the FM team to find out what it is that they want and how best to deliver that to them. And those applications, you can document it quite well. The gap in the industry that we see at the moment is you've got a lot of developers who develop and sell on, and they don't particularly look into the FM part of things. And you then, I wouldn't say guessing, but you take your best experience, put it in. Terminology such as VE comes in, things get cut out, and before you know it, you end up with it all being watered down. So when you get to the end of it, all you end up with is a set of O&M manuals and sometimes just a couple of CAD drawings, which is then handed over to the FM team. And then they come in, they look at it, and they've got a whole host of stuff which they don't actually know what to do with or how to manage it.
Yeah.
And that's a shame, but quite common here.
Maybe another one just to add on to that question, and then we'll ask for some comments, is that we talk about closing the loop as well, which is that if you look at how the building actually performs, and then see what you constructed and how it actually performs. And then if that information is then fed back to the next building you design, I don't know that really this is something that happens too much either.
No, from a design perspective, we will put a lot of design assumptions in to a design based on either our experience or they're design assumptions. We've got, the BMS from a mechanical MEP perspective is an awesome tool for monitoring and logging and doing design validation. The trick is getting access to it after the fact is where the problem lies. Either you don't have physical access, or when you do get access, it is in a very unstructured, unpresentable manner. And it's difficult to get that information out. Once you've got it, you can do a huge amount of, there are huge benefits to getting access to it, interpreting it, and learning from it. Yeah. And what you learn, you can then design into your future jobs. Maybe you were too conservative in one aspect and a little bit under-conservative in another. And you can flush those problems out. Yeah. But again, it comes to the access. You hand over to the client, he says, thank you very much. It sits on the server and it's like, just can't get in.
Joylin, is that something that you've been able to do? Have you been able to actually get operational data on a building you've designed and get that feedback to understand if it's actually performed as it was originally designed to?
Well, honestly speaking, I haven't. The project that I'm doing is still under construction, so I can't speak of the FM stage, but the whole goal on our side is to ensure that once we design something, once we model something, it will be useful at the end of the stage, that the FM, once they move to BIM, they actually can see that this column will be at this location, or there's a pipe in this location. Yeah. Yeah.
And
maybe I'd just add something. Actually, to fill this gap, we have one way of two. Yeah. The first way is to build the FM people early as much as possible and let them overlap with the construction, let them dictate their requirements, which I believe is not practical and it's very difficult to happen for several reasons. First of all, in many cases, the client is not deciding about his FM. Even for some hotel operators, the client even is not nominated until the last stage. And even they nominate and we get the requirements and in the midway they change. That happened already a couple of times, even for hotel operators. But the other way around, which I believe is more practical, is to put a certain clear benchmark standards in between to fill that gap from wherever the contractor needs to reach and wherever the FM needs to start. And that both parties need to align themselves to. I believe this part of the job, like this kind of benchmark, is not so clear in the market at the moment, and what's causing a big confusion between project to project.
Yeah. I think an interesting one there is that I think the market or the industry has decided that Kobe, for example, is that sort of, it's a standard you can write in that potentially will meet the requirement at the end of the day. But I think what's happening, what we're now finding is that it's not necessarily that. It was a nice thing to have at the time, and yes, it gives you all this structured information, but it's still not, I don't think, really meeting necessarily the requirements of these FM operators. Yeah. I
think the lack of experience in handing over digital data to the operation stage and the operational information requirements that we have nowadays are mainly driven by the legacy systems, CAFM systems, computer-aided facility management systems, is driving the adoption of COBE, which is an unconscious adoption, I would say. Yeah. And to get where we need to be in terms of asset information requirements, I think we as a region, or the industry in this region, we haven't had enough time to get there and learn the lessons of what exactly is required at the operation stage in terms of big data within the BIM models that we hand over. Yeah. So I think it will take a pilot or two for us to get there.
Yeah. I was interested in your comment, Mansour, about you had these two options, for how to bridge that gap. I'm concerned though that it's not in a client's interest to to want to do this themselves. You know, to me, we talk about successful outcomes. You know, what are the clients' outcomes that they required at the beginning of the project? Now, surely that's the successful operation of whatever they're going to build. You know, so it would seem strange that, of course, you then have a client who wouldn't put a facilities management team in place if for no other reason to ensure that that handover and then that operation runs as smoothly as possible. I'm not quite sure why the clients aren't actively pursuing this.
It happens in many cases that the client themselves are not so clear about their FM requirement in the future, and at that occasion they leave it to consultant to decide on their behalf, although at the time of operation consultant might not be there. And they might rely on a certain experiment and a certain kind of project which is not 100% applicable in the other. And this is a problem which we are occasionally seeing copy and paste specification, which definitely is not going to work in all the cases.
But just on that, one of the things that comes up quite often during the tender negotiations is the BMS data points is an easy target for VE. Do we really need to monitor all of these things? And from an operational perspective, yes, it makes your life easier as an operator. You can delete them. It means you've then got to employ some guy who goes there and does it manually. And unfortunately, it just boils down to people don't necessarily see the value of spending the money on a sophisticated system that monitors. And it happens on a lot of projects here at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. I've got a real classic question here that I'm sure will cause a bit of discussion, and that is, who owns this data? This data that we're all generating, this data that we're all passing around from stage to stage, from company to company. You know, who owns it? But not only who owns it, does it really matter? Surely, is it, you know, it's a client's project, is it not their data? Who would like to pick up on that one?
Well, I think the owner of the information is the information author. But what happens is when you move that information across to a contractor, then it becomes a liability for them if they want to take it and work with it. So it's like a Word document or an email that you keep forwarding to different people. The more it's being built to it, it doesn't matter if, I don't know, if the designer did a mistake. If the contractor took it over and he said it's fine, then it's a risk for the contractor. If the contractor passes the FM model to the client and the client or his consultant say it's okay, and maybe they build on it as well, it becomes their risk. But just to answer your question, I think always the information, the ownership of the information resides with the author, like a Word document.
But so just to clarify, though, you know, there's many authors.
Yeah, but everybody takes from the other author, and when you take the information and change it, like you change that Word document, it becomes yours. Of course, the contractual mechanisms can be customized in a way to spread that, to say that clearly, but it's not the same owner from the beginning until the end. And I think in the past, clients used to say we own the CAD drawings from the beginning until the end. But in a BIM environment, I think things are a bit different.
I think we also see in construction jobs, the word for information kind of covers you a little way, that you're sharing this for information. This information is going to help you solve your problems, help you get there quicker. So I'm giving you this for information. It seems to cover you in a contractual maybe blame if the information is wrong.
But don't you think some of this thinking is back when we had this siloed mentality, you know, and you know, the design was done and then passed over with no connection whatsoever. Isn't the future that we're talking about, as our first panelist and speaker were talking about, is that we are so much more connected than that, or should be so much more connected than that, that your designer is talking to your contractor, such that when that information is passed over, there is an element of confidence in it. And then similarly, you know, the contractor is talking to the FM operator again, so that when that, but you know, the problems come when you chop all this up and you have all this movement of information. If we were much more connected and we were all talking to each other, which is not what we're supposed to be doing anyway, then surely the you know, that flow of data could easily be allowed to move from one organization to the next, and ultimately lie with the client for operation when the job is complete.
Yeah, so one of the things that drives us is to try and make that flow of information sort of seamless across projects. You know, the better that information can flow and can be tracked, the better that you can connect the teams to perform processes, the better the project runs. From a system platform point of view, one of the questions that often comes up with regards to data ownership, the client will say, I own all the data. Give me access to all the data. But what we've done as a platform is we've not taken a view on who owns the data. So we won't configure the system in such a way that gives the client access to everything. What we do is we allow people just to see what they have put onto the platform and what they have received on the platform. And then we, you know, just like in the paper world, you know, you need to actually physically do a handover in the paper world. Well, it's the same, we believe, in the digital world as well. So we protect all parties on projects so that they can collaborate internally, but then they can easily collaborate up and down the supply chain. But then it's really about configuring it so that at the end of the project, that the teams are able to hand that over to the client according to the handover requirements or the ownership requirements. So that's how we view it.
If I might change the scale on this a little bit, and maybe we're even not so much talking about BIM. We talk a lot about smart cities, you know, in the future of smart cities, and that has been a very data-centric, you know, place. This intelligent city that we're going to live in, where every system is connected. With everything connected in a city, though, I think we're looking at something that's bigger than BIM. And when you're talking, you know, the city or maybe even country, you know, the size of a country. And I know that a lot of people have started to talk about GIS, right? And there's a big discussion at the moment about the relationship with BIM and GIS and how they sit and how that data is even passed between those two topics. How do you see this? Has anyone experience of this when you scale it up, the different kind of data that's involved? For example, we're talking about master planning. I was talking about master planning to someone recently, and they were saying that it's a different data set that you're talking when you're talking to someone about a master plan of a new city. You know, has anyone had that kind of experience? With this difference between BIM and GIS and the level of data that needs to be talked about? Yeah?
Well, I've had a year of experience with a government entity here in Dubai, and we had a GIS team as well as a BIM team putting out the requirements for the supply chain. And as a master developer, we had the larger database of the properties that we owned in a GIS platform, where if you wanted to dive in one step deeper, you would then want to go into a BIM data environment. So I would think that the GIS, as you rightly mentioned, is more of a master scale, where big data in terms of plots, plot limits, the high-level asset data sits, while if you want to dive into equipment or detail level of it, you would definitely require an asset model.
Yeah. And I think when you start to go up to that scale, there's social elements become involved, you know, like
Yes.
how people actually live in a city, how they make a city work. And that influences the data that you're talking about at
Yeah.
that level as well.
And then the challenge at that level is obviously generating this information, generating data through different means such as sensors and other surveillance systems to be able to, for example, identify the hotspots of the public movement for a business decision down the line to, let's say, put a shop here or there.
Yeah.
Where is my, you know, which is not necessarily a BIM data function.
Yeah. If I can change it again, so there's a philosophy called DIKW. DIKW is data, information, knowledge, and wisdom, and it's built on a pyramid, with data being in the bottom of that pyramid. Data, information derived from the data, knowledge derived from the information, and wisdom is on the top. And it's felt that, and in fact, I think you even mentioned it, Edward, earlier, that those bottom three levels are very much kind of almost past. You know, it's the data you've already collected, it's the information you've ascertained from that data. So it's already in the past. But the wisdom part is seen as very much the human interaction. Yeah, so we can gather all this data and we can understand what it's telling us, but the human wisdom part at the very top of this triangle is the question. Yeah, and what I'd like to maybe put to a number of you is, you know, in your organisation, this human element where you're looking at information, you might be looking at trends, you might be looking at cost, whatever it is that drives what your business does. In order to be looking to the future or to be looking to what you do with that information, it needs a person. You know, it's talked about that maybe a computer or AI or machine learning could do that. You know, can do the data, the information, and the knowledge part. But the wisdom part is very much the human brain that's required. You know, where do you see that maybe in your own organisations? You know, you've got all this data, but you know, what do you do with it? How, do you ask if you need to ask the right questions? I have a quote which says that, which I've lost, that, you know, data on itself is nothing. You know, it needs to be processed to be made valuable. Yeah, John.
So when we speak of data in BIM perspective, so BIM itself, 70% to 60 to 70% is made of geometry, and 30 to 40% is made of information. And then there are also, luckily for us, most of the software makes the BIM information structured. There's also unstructured data. But as another set of data that relates me as a BIM leader, BIM manager, is the performance of my models. I want to be a BIM lead. I don't want to be a firefighter. I don't want someone from my team telling me in the very last minute of the deadline that, hey Joy, we will not be able to submit because the model is so slow, because the model is so big. With BIM data analytics, we can actually see trends of how big the model goes as time goes by, or how many warnings that we need to resolve. So prior to the submission date or prior to the deadline, we can actually decide on if we're gonna divide the model. And also at Oricon, we're actually a multinational company. We can actually, with big data analytics, we can actually compare how our model performance works. If how long does it take for the model to open? How long does it take for our model to load? We can actually compare it to various offices. We can actually compare it how is Australia performing, how is Singapore performing, how is South Africa performing. And with those analysis, there's actually a lot of analysis tool or visualization tool for big data. We have Power BI, we have Tableau, and for Autodesk, they're now releasing BIM 360 and analytics or analysis. And given those data and information, it's a question of the wisdom part. Will I be proactive? Will I be reactive? Will I be part of the solution, or will I just solve the problem?
Anyone else on this?
From our side on a business case study, one of the things that we would take away from data from existing clients and stuff is obviously we'd want to look at how we can better or have the client better use the system. Can they increase efficiencies, reduce energy consumption? There's a huge amount of information that they're sitting on. They just don't know how to interpret it. And you've got the data, what do you do with it? And one area which is a little bit lacking here is coming in there, analysing it and saying, you can have the following benefits by doing this to your system and make the building work better, more efficient. You may be able to do some upgrades and stuff without actually having to increase your capital plant, just through analysing what you're doing. Some things you might be doing well, other things you can improve on.
Anyone else?
Just to follow on what Joy said, I think data is good, but again, overload, like the client who wanted everything, is bad. And if we go and show a client, I work with cost, so I'll talk about cost. If we show him a schedule with thousands of lines of different elements in the model, he won't be happy about it because he doesn't want to see that. So again, even with data, we have a problem with lessons learned in our industry. We don't get lessons learned. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, and they don't get passed on to, you asked earlier about facilities management and clients. They never come back to us saying the building we've done is performing at within the parameters that were set at design. We're not sharing lessons learned between us, and maybe it's a sign of weakness to put the lessons learned and say I failed here. But in my view, whenever you fail, you also win because you learn a lot. But lessons learned are only for professional institutions talking about CPDs. They are in PMP exams, but they don't really happen. After a project is done, I'm not sure how many of you do a summary of what went well, what went wrong, and what you learned about it, and more importantly, share that with the teams, other people.
I think that's striking with me, standards. That if you follow a set of standards, we're following the PAS suite of standards. So lessons learned are part of that standard. Client satisfaction once handover as well, and follow up. So I suppose in the area, nobody's really following a set of standards, or there's no published set of standards for the Middle East, whereas we're following the PAS 1192, which covers lessons learned and that as well. So standardization would be another key factor in the process.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll maybe get time to take a few questions from the audience, if there's a few questions that anyone has.
One of the problems we have as a contractor, what we've noticed is about this material approval and submittal processes which we have, which I think is another question of big data in a certain sense. We have so many of these products which we've used continuously in a project, and I think somebody spoke about an airport project or something like that. So is there any possibility that these can be so standardized that we could just lift it rather than every contractor who comes, we've got to do this experiment again with every client, every test, and that's one of the long processes which add costs and delays to projects. So in big data, can we address this issue in any particular manner?
I think we're a contractor's key to answer that one.
Yes.
Actually, we talked a while ago about the ownership, and as a simple answer, we said whoever owned the information is the owner of it, but all the time with the ownership, we're stuck with the intellectual property. So if someone have his own patent or intellectual property for his own material, that cannot be standardized or copied for others. So for everyone owned a specific intellectual property, he needs to still maintain ownership of such information. If we talk about standardization here, we still need not to go bypass the individual rights on that. So I think this is the only problem which we face against standardization. Otherwise, it would be a single material for all the projects.
Does that answer your question, or is it?
It's a complicated issue, but if you look at sustainability, which is maybe the next topic, and we want speed and we want to save costs using BIM, so we are discussing possibilities. I think there was a university doing research that why can't we have, let's say, low-cost housing, for example, have standard data, have the data, and just like a McDonald's or a Subway unit, apply it across different places. So why do we have to research, for example, an expansion joint, which, for example, costs a lot of time, and it's only about the standards, and it's not about any design rights. I'm not talking about interior design rights, but standard building materials, maybe 20, 25 of them as data, and if we can know how much can be used, will help the contractor, will help the manufacturer with the data, so that everybody knows what's the demand, what can be supplied, and where can we get it. I'm talking about uses of big data, so if we know that value and components.
Yeah. No, good point. Good point. You want to add to that?
I think the low-hanging fruit there is all around just making sure that you're working in a digital way. So having what sort of company are you with? Are you with a contractor, did you say? Yes. Okay.
They're different divisions.
Okay. So I think implementing a common data environment within your company or within your project should mean that as you go forward in time, that that information is captured and it's there at the end of the project and into the future, so that you can use it. And then it's just a simple kind of search function to be able to go back and look at, okay, what were all the materials that were approved on different projects? I mean, there's probably some good tools out there for sucking that data out, but I think step one is digitizing it.
I think we're out of time. So, sorry. Right. Well, last question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Interesting topic. Big data. It's a big topic. No pun intended. What I didn't hear though, and I'm interested to hear from the panelists, especially from the ACONEX side, Oracle side, because they claim that they have the largest construction database, which is probably right. You haven't talked about what's the cost of developing learning models to really interrogate the data for the different business use cases that you want to use it for. You have a large database, a construction database, but really how good is that data that you have and make use of it? And what's the cost of making that happen? So for instance, if you do construction supervision and you use AI to really be able to identify safety issues, quality issues, what have you on construction site, whether for the contractors or for the construction supervision team, what's the cost of doing that? If you want to use it to optimize the construction sequencing, right, and optimize the schedule without degrading the quality, what's the cost of doing that? And is it data that you have? Can it give you that result?
Okay. Anyone?
Yeah, I think the cost of BIM processes on a project, no matter at what stage it is and with which stakeholder, depends on the maturity of that organization. If the organization is BIM mature and they know how to handle digital processes, it should be business as usual, as mentioned many times this morning. And if it's not, then it's obviously going to incur cost, and it's going to become a more costly project to the client, whether they are dealing with the consultant or with the client. Now I think what we are lacking, and that probably brings up the question back to you, is the maturity of the subcontracting chain, where subcontractors don't have their content digitally available, suppliers and subcontractors. So if all of us in the supply chain mature at an equal rate, I think if I'm the client, I wouldn't want to pay to my supply chain to be more efficient and digital and modern. I think now it costs money, but in the future it shouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Last comment, Derek.
Building a case study is probably what you're doing for the cost of a piece of software. But if you just look at a construction site, if you have 50 subcontractors and you gather the data of who is not performing to their health and safety standards, or whose housekeeping is time and time again not performing, and you gather all that data, you don't use that subcontractor on the next project, or maybe you bring him in, show him that data and get him to perform better for the next stage of the project. You're also saving time for your health and safety coordinators on site, not having to deal with these issues time and time again. your QA, QC get on site and inspect more things, make it value, and not be looking after housekeeping for a bad subcontractor. So you have to gather the data to make the case study to then see the real value on a project.
Thank you very much. We've run out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.
Thanks.